questions. There's stuff that I picked up from Bloomberg round about Christmas time, and then the letter from Neva Mechetler, which was in Business Day the other day. Right, so let's put it all into context. So far, we've been talking about the theory of international trade, and turn it down a bit. Okay. Is that better? Yep. Okay. So we've been talking about the theory of international trade, and we kicked it off by talking about the early mercantilists who didn't really have a theory, they had an objective. And we then saw that the classical economists, Hume, Adam Smith, David Ricardo in particular, had ideas about trade and the possibility that there could be general gains from trade. In other words, the trade wasn't a zero-sum game where if someone was going to win, somebody else had to lose, but that in fact both parties could benefit. The problem is that that model is mathematically elegant, technically impeccable, provided you make a few rather rigorous assumptions. Assumption one, it's at a point in time. So I have X, you have Y, let's swap, we're both better off, fantastic. Should we commit ourselves long term to specialization and the division of labor, which was how Adam Smith said you create wealth? Find out what you do best and do it, and then trade the produce with other people who found what they do best and are doing it. And then the total level of production globally goes up and everybody is better off. But by committing yourself to one thing, by saying this is where our comparative advantage lies, are you potentially hanging yourself out to dry? Are you basically saying the world is not going to change? And the one thing that we know about the world is it does, and it changes rapidly. There have, however, been a series of other critiques. And one of them came from the far left. So it's a Marxist critique. And I'm going to put it in here, not because I necessarily believe in it, but because it persuaded a lot of people, and because there is a policy outcome. Now, whether that policy outcome is achievable or not, we'll leave to subsequent debate. But let's have a look. This is the story of unequal exchange. And I'm then going to look at issues of costs of adjustment in an era of trade liberalization, which is down to a Korean economist, Ha-Joon Chang. So, the first, Frank and Emmanuel, a good Marxist, Greek and French, and Ha-Joon Chang, who actually is Bradley's sort of particular enthusiasm. So I'm going to ask him to bear with me. Okay, let's have a look. We mentioned yesterday a question. We've got the dominions, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada do fantastically. Their economies boom, everything is great. South Africa doesn't. Now, in terms of natural endowments, we are no worse off than they are. Australia is drier than us. It's further away from European markets than us. It actually has very little that we don't have. In terms of the people by whom they were settled, there's actually not a great deal of difference. South Africa was Dutch and English, Canada was French and English, Australia was Irish and English. And New Zealand was basically a lot of sheep and some shepherds. So why on earth did South Africa so underperform? Now, Ricardian theory, comparative advantage, doesn't work. It doesn't help us explain. Because South Africa specialized in its areas of comparative advantage, and so did all the others. All of them started off as agricultural and mining states. And all of them have, to some extent, progressed since then. And yet the others, in terms of income per capita, are way ahead of us. So what's the problem with Ricardo? Well, the fact is his theory just doesn't fit the realities. Ricardo's theory assumes that you have two states and that capital and labor cannot flow between them. So you do what you do best, somebody else does what they do best, or least worst anyway in the case of Ricardo, but funds, machinery, and labor don't flow between them. Secondly, there's a presumption that what it's all about is not the issue of labor. That in terms of classical economics, it was assumed that all workers would earn a bare subsistence wage, what the Marxists later call the iron law of wages. That you have a reserve army of unemployed in Marxist terms, and that workers earn just enough to keep the population going. It's very Malthusian. And there's also an assumption that both of you have got full employment. And nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, so the reason that Ricardian theory gives the results it does is it assumes that the only way you can produce more of one product is by producing less of another. So the rational thing to do is to specialize. But if you've got huge amounts of unutilized resources, well, then what's the point? Just use your spare resources to create the stuff that you need. Why import it? The other thing is, in yesterday's session, we talked about Locke, Prebisch, and Singer, who said maybe there's something about primaries, primary commodities, minerals, agriculture, so on and so forth, that is inherently problematic. But in fact, all of the dominions started off with agriculture and mining as a basis. And all of them still have this as a major source of income. New Zealand, bless it, still survives, even after Rogernomics, on exports of powdered milk and mutton. You know, sheep and cows are what keep the New Zealand economy going. And a bit of movie-based tourism now. So clearly that's not the issue. So what is it? Well, the one theory is that it could be this notion of unequal exchange. And understanding exactly what unequal exchange is takes a bit of doing. Now, please don't be put off by either of these definitions, because I'm going to try and offer you something which is a little more amenable in a second. But the two names that we always associate with this are Samir Amin and Argiri Emmanuel. We mentioned the other day the factual terms of trade. The idea that when you look at the barter terms of trade, the question of how much of this do you get for that, that there was this long-term declining secular trend in the barter terms of trade, which was moving against primary commodities. That was Locke Prebisch's great insight. And And we saw that one of the objections to this was that the barter terms of trade don't tell you anything, really. What you want to know is how much labor and other factors of production went into this, and how much labor and other factors of production went into that. And now let's have a look at what's happening if we're talking about swapping factors of production, land, labor, and capital. Those that are embodied in a ton of cocoa and those that are embodied in a ton of tractor, is that declining? And that would be the double factorial terms of trade. Now, if those are nice and stable, and they're equal basically to 1, in other words, the amount of labor here is equal to the amount of labor there, fantastic. But if it isn't, then according to Singer and Emmanuel, you have unequal exchange. There's less of your labor being exchanged for a certain amount of mine. So first world countries, according to him, put less labor into the products that they are trading than the third world does. So I swap one of these for one of those, but one of these is X days of labor, and one of those is a lot less than X days of labor. You've got a problem. Okay? Our workers are being hammered by your workers. A possibility. This assumes, of course, that we can measure labor, that labor is somehow rather homogeneous, and also you see the potential problems. Emmanuel has this definition. He talks about the net transfer of embodied labor hours. There's a good Marxist for you. Or value. And is usually a simple analytical result of different capital intensities between branches of production. In other words, the amount of labor that's in this product is probably a result of the amount of machinery that's going into it, as much as anything else. And we know that the amount of machinery going into the exports of developed countries is very different to the amount of machinery in less developed countries. So let's try for a more straightforward approach to it. So he has a nice kind of historical approach. He begins with imperialism. So the age of empire. And he said, what was the point of empire? The point was to allow the exploitation of labor in less developed countries at lower wages. In other words, you set up your cotton spinning industry in India rather than in England because labor is cheaper in India. But the benefits, because of trade, are going to accrue to consumers in the developed world. So the trade, although it provides some benefit in the third world, the bulk of the benefit is accruing actually to the workers, not just to the employers in the first world. That there's this asymmetry in the outcomes. And he says, there are certain countries, whatever they undertake and whatever they produce, always exchange a larger amount of their national labor for a smaller amount of foreign labor. The fact is, there are some countries that are just like that, and they tend to be in the third world. And he says that the reason for this is that labor tends to be immobile, but capital is free to shift. It's kind of interesting because the one thing that we've noticed in the last decade, if you speak to any of the German electorate today, is the mobility of labor. That the low-paid jobs in Europe were first being done by Turks, and look, it's just nothing new. The navying jobs in England 100 years ago were being done by the Irish. Ireland was the third world of Europe. So the idea that capital is mobile but labor is immobile is perhaps a bit of an overstatement. But this is the basis of Emmanuel's approach, that the capital flows towards the places where your ability to exploit labor is greatest. Okay, it's interesting that he then sees a solution to this. He says, if the whole process of international trade is fundamentally unfair, it's not to say that there are no benefits accruing in the third world, but that the distribution of those benefits is very uneven. He says, well, what you need to do is to make sure that wages in the third world go up. And when we said, what was the problem with South Africa? The intuition of most of the people here was, we're poor because we always paid our workers relatively little. And if you pay your workers relatively little, then the productivity of your workers stays relatively low, and you have a problem. Now, this question, does South Africa have cheap labor? No, it doesn't. And it's fairly well established. South African labor simply is not cheap, but it is paid, or certainly was paid, relatively little. In Australia, they tried using imported labor, what they called Kanaka labor. They brought in people under really nasty conditions from the islands to cut sugarcane. But when that was unacceptable, they started automating the cane cutting process. Automating cane cutting is terribly wasteful. It means you can only use land which is fairly flat. It means that you have to have lots of small cane mills sort of close by rather than a few big cane mills long distances apart. Automating cane cutting is a problematic process in many ways. But once you've got it set up and you've got your cane processing systems in place and your whole industry is set up for it, you don't need all those workers. You send in the machines, you cut the stuff, you process it, and sure, there's a little bit of extra waste, but the cost savings are enormous. Productivity goes up, marvelous. South Africa has experimented with automated cutting, and there are some people who do it. But there's no serious commitment to it in the way that there was in Australia. If you look at agriculture in the United States and Canada, on the prairies, there are tractors the size of houses. Now, true, the land is open and flat, and the farms are large, and you need that. But if you look at the Maize Triangle in South Africa, we're using now much the same sort of tractor, much the same sort of harvester, because those are what you get. The days of a file yappy being used to plow in the Maize Triangle are long gone. But that means that we're generating unemployment here. The proportion of the United States' population which is engaged in agriculture is roughly 2%. It's tiny. And yet, agriculture is generating something like 20% of the United States' exports. The interesting feature of South Africa is the way that the agricultural sector, which is still a heavy labor user, has been hemorrhaging labor over the last few years. And there's a major debate. Is this an answer or is it a problem? So you've got to try and get your wages up if you want to have the prices embodied in a product to reflect the labor that's going into them, and you don't want asymmetric or unequal exchange. But how are you going to do this? Well, he says trade and aid aren't the answer. What he suggests is an export tax. Not just one export tax in one country, but a global export tax in third world, basically primaries, third world products. So everybody who is importing agricultural products, agricultural and mineral products from the third world is paying the tax. This forces the price of the products up in the market. And the tax is then distributed back to the third world with the proviso that it has to be used to diversify the economy, broaden its base, and so on and so forth. Great idea. He put this out in the 1960s. It ain't happening. Not yet, and not in a hurry. But the idea, you have to admit, is very elegant. All right. We now move on to the alternative. Okay, not a Marxist at all, but a serious critic of the economic orthodoxy. Okay, he teaches at Cambridge. I mean, he's right up there in the establishment. But he is suggesting that the conventional economics that is taught in the universities, neoclassical economics, is riddled with errors. And in fact, he has a book called 23, what is it, not popular economic fallacies, that's Joan Robinson Bradley.
23 things they don't tell you about.
That they don't tell you about, yep. It's a lovely text, and he's worth reading. He writes extremely well. And you can pick up a lot of his stuff online. If you just pop his name into Google, push a button, you'll have all sorts of his stuff. He really does have a public profile. And he kicks off by going back to the problem of opening up markets. Now, one of the great features of the 1970s and 80s was what we called structural adjustment. Masses of countries in the third world had all sorts of barriers and distortions surrounding their local manufacturers, their export industries, and so on and so forth. Large amounts of monopoly, oversized government and bureaucracies. Basically, they were inefficient. When they went to the IMF and the World Bank to look for loans, the Bretton Woods institutions said, okay, but before we give you a bean, you jack up your act. You cut back on the heavy sort of budget deficits. You cut back on the huge civil service. You cut back on the allowances you make for monopolies that are inefficient. You cut back on the barriers to trade. You identify your areas of comparative advantage and you just knock down the tariff walls. You get into international trade. In some cases, it worked relatively well. The classic example, not because it was imposed by the World Bank or the IMF, but it was imposed internally, was Chile. The Chilean economy took the advice of the Chicago boys who came straight back from Milton Friedman, and they liberalized everything, and it worked. New Zealand, what people subsequently called Rogernomics after their Minister of Finance, was an economy which was heavily protected, where the agricultural sector was given enormous support. And New Zealand was a basket case. And he came in a broom that just sort of swept everything, and the New Zealand economy was transformed almost overnight. Was the transformation painful? Yes, it was. The price of farms dropped almost overnight. But new farmers could now come in and buy a farm more cheaply, and they were efficient, and New Zealand's agricultural sector became globally competitive. It no longer relied on Commonwealth preference. Their economy's economic base broadened. It worked. Chile stopped its dependence on copper, and its economy became much more broad-based. So in cases, it worked. But in many cases through the third world, structural adjustment was a disaster. if I look back at the example of Zimbabwe, which was forced to have structural adjustment, they claimed that they were doing it voluntarily and internally, but they weren't. They didn't have the gumption to do what they should have done in one clean sweep. So the bureaucracy wasn't kept clean. The bureaucracy was allowed to do its own thing, but was warned that they might lose their jobs. Result, while they were in place, they started looking for ways to subvent their incomes, because you never know how long you're going to have the job. Zimbabwe's corruption problem actually starts, bang, right there, at structural adjustment, because it wasn't completed. Opening the gates to foreign trade meant that what industry there was in the country took an absolute hammering. In effect, you end up being forced back into this situation where what you're exporting is minerals and agricultural products. So before you go in for an adjustment package, you need to think through what's going to happen really carefully. And in particular, before you go in for an adjustment package that's going to involve dropping all barriers to trade, all tariff barriers. Secondly, he says the issue of static versus dynamic comparative advantage has to be recognized. Remember, Ricardo's notions of comparative advantage were static. Portugal, he said, is really good at wine. England is really good at cloth. Let's trade. Static. He is suggesting something very different. He says, let's have a look at 3 real success stories. And he gives the examples of Korea, Finland, and Japan. Now, Finland in 1960 was not a particularly wealthy country. They had lots of trees and snow, reindeer. And they decided to set up an industry which was going to be doing a bit of stuff on electronics and so on and so forth. They had a firm, and they had it doing all sorts of things, general manufactures, but they subvented its attempts to get into electronics. That firm was Nokia. And for 17 years, they subsidized Nokia's electronics business. But once they got it right, all of a sudden, Nokia had, well, Finland had a comparative advantage, had an absolute advantage in microelectronics. And for as long as Nokia ruled the world, they didn't keep it going long enough, but for many years, the Finnish economy boomed on the back of Nokia. Now, Nokia was a gamble. They were taking a chance. If someone had said to the Prime Minister of Finland in 1960, you're going to be making these little cell phones and selling them to the world, he would have laughed. But they took a chance, and it worked. Korea was a basket case. In 1952, there was nothing there. But they started off with heavy engineering, shipbuilding, and so on and so forth. A steel plant in the 1950s was not an expensive business. It was not that capital intensive, because you could now start making steel out of scrap. You weren't using old-fashioned Bessemer converters. So the amount of cash needed to set up wasn't huge. What you needed was lots of scrap. Get that going and set up a shipbuilding industry. Shipbuilding had gone from the Clyde to Japan and now went to Korea. And instead of riveting your ships, they picked up on what the Americans had started doing with the Liberty ships during the Second World War with continuous welding. And you welded these sheets of steel together. The technology was not hugely difficult. Being a riveter took years of training. Being a welder, not a big deal. And it worked. They took the shipbuilding industry away from Japan because they were cheaper and they were better. And Japan, in the interim, went into automobile manufacture in a big way and electronics in a big way. Korea then started. Korea had no notion of electronics, but there was this big company, Samsung. They put a bit of money into it. And the nice thing about Korea was that they had effectively infinite American funds. The American government could not afford to let Korea go down the tubes. Now, it was a heavily monopolistic system. The Korean economy is one that, when you look at it, should not be efficient. Everything that neoclassical economics tells us is monopolies are bad, oligopolies are evil. But the level of centralization in the Korean economy is huge. So all of these were examples of economies that took a chance. The state identified areas of potential advantage and started diverting funds into them, so that instead of being static, it became dynamic. You didn't have the advantage at the beginning. In no sense at all did Korea or Finland in 1950s and 60s have any advantage in electronics or automobile manufacture or anything like it. It was created. Okay, so Chang's comment, and this is a quote from him, that the rational choice individualistic foundation of neoclassical economics limits its ability to analyze the uncertain and collective nature of technological learning process. Learning is what it's all about. You need your workers to learn, you need your entrepreneurs to learn, you need your developmental engineers to learn. And that has to be done slowly, and it has to be supported. In the real world, he says, firms with uncertain prospects, and that's really important, you're taking a gamble, need to be created, protected, subsidized, and nurtured, possibly for decades. And these were all cases where it did literally go on for decades, if industrial upgrading is to be achieved. Now, the question is, looking at the populace of Finland, which was super well educated, or Japan, which was learning obsessed, modern day China, which is learning obsessed, Korea, which became learning obsessed. Taking that sort of gamble meant you were saying, we believe that our populace could become a source of comparative advantage in the manufacturing sector. Now, it's not as if Japan wasn't involved in all sorts of protection of strange sorts. Japan's protection of its rice industry has been an absurdity for years. The price of rice in Japan for years was 7 times the global price, because they wanted to protect rice growing, because it was part of the Japanese. It's the same way as the French protect small farmers in France. Does it make financial sense? No, but it's in the national psyche. But protecting the sort of newly industrialized sectors and providing opportunities for young workers to come in and for skills to be developed, that's a different story. And so the question comes, in that sort of world, what is the role of the state? Now, one of the things that South Africa has been talking about a lot, it's one of those buzzwords that you hear, is the developmental state. And it sounds as if what you had in Korea and Japan and China, let it be said, and Finland was indeed a developmental state. But the idea, I admit, scares me. An overly involved bureaucracy, which is not selected for efficiency and is bloated, could be a real problem. That we accept that laissez-faire has perhaps had its day. The laissez-faire economy is too risky. But what he calls a facilitative state, a state that says, let's find what people do best. Let's encourage, let's prompt, let's nudge. Let's provide secure property rights, a good system of law, a situation where levels of corruption are low, a situation where we have risk, yes, but uncertainty, no. That's the facilitative state. It's the ideal. Businessmen are always going to take risks. That's what business is about. But you want to minimize the uncertainty and provide probabilities. Okay, so he gives 4 recommendations, and these come from a little piece which is actually available online in the Post-Autistic Economics Review. The first one is, he says, actually people need to know about the problems with trade. We actually need to educate the third world into the possibility that trade has perhaps been hammering them over the years, that they haven't been getting a square deal. His term allowed the developing countries to make more informed choices. Fair enough. That is uncontroversial. The second, he says, and this is now talking about typically the IMF and the World Bank, but there are others, the conditions attached to bilateral and multilateral financial assistance. Okay, so aid should be radically changed. He says the orthodox recipe isn't working, and there must be alternatives. So the expression trade not aid is a sensible place to start. But if you give aid, it should be on very clearly defined terms. The sort of random distribution of funds through the government, rather than targeted project aid, has got a bad and worsening reputation. Then he says the WTO rules, the World Trade Organization, says the rules should be rewritten so that they allow developing countries to use tariffs and subsidies for industrial development. Now, currently the WTO is dedicated to reducing all tariff and subsidy interventions. That's the aim of the World Trade Organization. So he's saying, look, if you're in the third world, you need to be allowed some latitude. But the latitude shouldn't just be surrounding things like tariffs and subsidies. He says things like patent laws and intellectual property rights should also be included. Now, some states have just jumped the gun. So India, for instance, has a booming pharmaceuticals industry on the back of saying, the hell with the rules and regulations. And it works well, but it doesn't make them necessarily popular. The point is, he's arguing that we should try and legitimize this. If we legitimize it, then people don't have to go and do this off their own bat and make themselves unpopular. So it can be constrained, but some allowance. And then, lastly, he said, you need to improve the institutions of government. Now, one of the problems that we see is that first world countries do well because people feel secure. They know where they stand. If you're going to invest in a business, you want to know that you'll be able to hand it on to your children if need be. You want to know that there won't just be some random Joe will pitch up and say, actually, I like the look of that, please hand it over, as sometimes happens. In other words, you need stability and security. And the institutions can also be institutions of learning. The nature of the tax structure. Institutions cover all sorts of things. But the institutional foundation of a country can make it easy to do business or difficult to do business. And that has to be sorted out. Again, it's the idea of getting rid of the uncertainties. Okay, I was going to finish here, and then I thought, well, there is one other little bit that I can add. There's an economist, Turkish economist who's in the United States, Dani Rodrik, who's come up with a couple of thoughts. He was talking about the tensions of globalization. And it's the first one that I want to focus on. That he has these three. But he says, we live in a globalizing world. Now, we talked about the mobility of labor. But the labor that is most mobile is labor that has skills. If you're a professional, if you're an artisan who really knows his stuff, you can go pretty much anywhere. And you'll move to the labor markets which reward you best. If, on the other hand, you're unskilled, you're on a hiding to nothing. A, because nobody wants you, and B, because increasingly you're at risk of being replaced by a machine. There was a little piece in the paper the other day about driverless cars, where they said the driverless car isn't a threat to the individual who owns one. It's a threat to the truck driver. Because currently, trucking stuff across countries like South Africa or the United States employs large numbers of people. They're not necessarily the most skilled or the brightest, and they're often getting on in years. But it's a secure, stable living for people who are not particularly skilled. Driving a big truck is a job that demands skill, but in terms of mobility, there's no world market for truck drivers. But come the driverless truck, the possibility that you have one vehicle in front and then a whole host that maybe go along behind it that just sort of lock in like a road train, all of them automated. The potential threat to the world's truck drivers is huge. And it's not as if they can reskill and move to Silicon Valley. Okay? People are not all equal. And that's the threat of globalization. For Rodrik, the real tension is that globalization is increasing the gap between the skilled and the unskilled. Not just globally, but domestically as well. Because as the skilled leave a country, those who are left behind get higher and higher wages. Their skills become scarcer and scarcer. So it's causing problems. Okay, and I'm going to stop there. Bang on, 45 minutes. Right, questions?
previous 4 points that were mentioned?
Yep,
Um,
those.
yeah, where have they worked?
So these are his recommendations. And he builds his recommendations on his experience largely of places like Korea. He contends that what Korea can do, or has done, could be done by other places if they put their mind to it. So, yeah, I mean, he's basing it on his observations.
You might have answered it, so do forgive me. Why is it that South Africa, as the one, in the four dominions, Canada succeeded, Australia succeeded, New Zealand, why hasn't South Africa? What were the other three dominions?
They shot out their native populations and we didn't.
Sorry?
They shot out their populations. They left themselves with no cheap labor. Literally. South Africa came to depend on cheap labor. The mines, agriculture, industry. And it set itself up in a system which perpetuated cheap labor. And Emmanuel's approach is to say, if South Africa had faced a labor shortage the way that the other three did, they had profound labor shortages, which could only be met by immigration from Europe. If South Africa had had a labor shortage, then they would have industrialized in a very different way. They would have priced their products in a different way. They would have exploited their resources in different ways. And so you have this situation that what the old National Party government saw as a source of comparative advantage was actually a liability. They needed to get rid of this notion of cheap, unskilled labor. They needed to skill their workforce and pay them properly. And that was the antithesis of all that Hendrik Verwoerd was thinking was appropriate. He felt that the appropriate thing to do was to keep South Africa's black population as unskilled labor. Which is it's perhaps a harsh judgment, but I think intuitively most people would agree with it.
Another way of saying that is, I forget the name of the guy who compared economies which started off as family farmsteads and compared that to extractive industries, and it's about how politically powerful your citizens are. So if you have this large disenfranchised population,
there's no sense of cooperation.
Yeah.
And the result is that you have an industrial system which is in which there's no reciprocal trust. That the work floor in Germany or Sweden has workers and managers who actually believe in each other and who are mutually supportive, because it evolved out of a system of sort of artisanal agglomerations. The British and American systems don't have that, and we are actually on the far side of what they have. The level of mistrust and the lack of cooperation between workers and unions, unions and workers and management is a problem. Now, someone asked the other day, what was the secret of Singapore's economic success? There was this recognition by the Singaporean government that they needed to get the workforce on side. And so they they pushed the unions, but they got the unions to sign up. Initially, I think it was to 6 years without any union action. And they said, if you'll give us 6 years with no union action, we'll get in the international investors and you'll get the benefits. And the international investors came, and in fact, the unions haven't had to do anything because wages started rising really rapidly. So, it can be done. But remember that the Singaporean approach to government is fairly draconian in some ways. It's not all for jam. There's a downside. Yeah.
Did Korea have education before industrialization or industrialization?
They came together. It was a co-evolution. And that, I think, is one of the things that Ha-Joon Chang is trying to push, that you need to actually make a leap of faith. He gives the example of step ladders. He said, you identify the ladders that you want to be your source of growth, the ladders you're going to climb. The question is, how far apart do the rungs have to be? If you make the rungs too far apart, if you make the jump, the leap of faith too great, you're going to fall on your face. It needs to be just enough. It doesn't have to be infinite small iterations, but you take a chance.
So they didn't have a well-educated workforce?
No.
Okay.
If you think about South Korea in 1952, at the end of the Korean War, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
There was literally nothing there. They had been hammered by the Japanese as a colony until 1945, and they had barely recovered from that when the Korean War starts. It was a shocker.
Want to offer us some thoughts on the current crisis in the South African poultry?
Okay, so, and is there a right answer? No, whatever I say, I'm going to get hung out to dry. If you look at the little letter, I don't know if you got the handout that came through. I think the last bit of it is Neva Meketla's letter in Business Day, which is where she makes some very good points. She makes some really good points. On the other hand, we need to ask, Rainbow Chickens is in trouble now, in part because we've had a disastrous maize season. It's not just the foreign imports, it's that the biggest single expense in the chicken business is feed. And we've had a whopping drought. And feed has become really expensive. And unless you had long-term contracts, you were going to be in trouble. Now, would it make sense for some sort of short-term subsidy to see them through so they don't have to close down all their farms in the face of... You need to ask, once we're back to a normal maize season, would they be competitive or not? That's the underlying question.
But there's a futures market in
There is,
this. Huge futures market.
absolutely. But it's 6 months.
There's a futures market.
So the point is that they took a beating because they didn't hedge sufficiently far into the future. And
In terms of the treaty that have caught them short,
yeah,
as much as there's a propensity in North and South to keep the rest of
that's right. is being dumped. Yes.
And it's being dumped in South Africa
And,
in instances of production.
and that is something that the WTO should allow you to react against. So WTO rules permit that. The specifics of the deal that was negotiated, I've found a bit sort of strange, but I haven't looked at it in sufficient detail. What has been coming through, though, is that the big impact on our chicken market has not yet been the Americans. It's been European and Brazilian chicken. And what we're doing with European chicken, which is coming from a heavily protected background, there you really do have a right to countervailing duties. If you have a product that's coming in from a protected situation, you have a right to impose countervailing duties. Brazil, I don't think, is subsidizing. I stand to be corrected. And of course, the American situation, the maize farmers of the United States are heavily protected. So it would be fair enough for the South African chicken industry, the poultry industry, to calculate the level of effective protection and demand a countervailing duty in response to that. But it should be at best countervailing. It shouldn't just be a tariff barrier that protects them in perpetuity and allows inefficiency. And I think what Neva was suggesting in that letter was that there are two big poultry producers, only one of them is crying, the other one isn't. And that's an interesting question.
I haven't read the letter yet, and I look forward to reading it. But I found that there's an interesting history on the left, an approach to these issues, which quite. Ken told me about Bismarck, who was sitting with his advisor and looking as to which journalists they were going to put onto the Prussian payroll. And his advisor suggested, what about Karl Marx? And Bismarck said, absolutely not. And his advisor said, this is because he's a communist. And Bismarck said, no, we've got plenty of communists on our payroll. He's a free trader. Huh. And and we have it now. Now that the left in South Africa has had to give up on a planned economy, all of the focus the production is seen as big bad white business, and all of the focus has gone into consumer protection. We've got to get hysterical over the cost of producing a loaf of bread, and meanwhile, how many jobs are hemorrhaged out of the economy into producing? We've got 40% unemployment. They don't seem to care about that as long as we've got cheap chickens. Where people are going to get salaries to pay for these chickens, well, that's another matter, But it's all consumption, obsessed with consumption, because the producers are big bad business who must get screwed anyway.
Yes. I'm not sure how I could respond, but yes. Other thoughts? Yes.
Sorry, so if all these countries have chosen an area of expertise and something to specialize in, what should we do? What fields of expertise should we channel our energy into and protect?
Well, the interesting thing is that they all said the first thing you need to do is get your education system right. And in fact, once your education system is right, you can do almost anything. If you think about it, South Africa, in terms of geographic positioning, in terms of our natural resources, we should be able to do almost anything. And we have a broad, diversified base for the economy. Now, the trouble is that our system of education is appalling, and the